our next session. Thankfully, both our panelists need no introduction. Please welcome Tarun Tejpal and Mallika Sarabhai, who will be talking about Tarun's latest book, The Line of Mercy. A round of applause, please. Can we have a round of applause?
Hello. Please sit down so that we can go on. We're already eaten into their time. I'd just like to say a few words about Tarun Tejpal. Tarun, I've known for a long, long time. In fact, there are quite a lot of people here who worked together with Tarun and me when I was in the Indian Express. And Geetan, his wife, who's also here, I employed. Tarun reminded me 1985, 1 year after Blue Star, Geetan joined me in the Indian Express, and soon after, Tarun joined me, and we worked together. And Kamar Sandhu, who you just heard, he was one of my reporters at that time. And there are also Vijaya, Pramod, Nirupama, all of whom are here. Before that, and I'd also like to say that Tarun told me that he's been asked many times to launch his book, but he's decided that he will do it here in Kasauli. So we are a little privileged to have Tarun here launching his book. I don't think he's made very many public appearances in the last 3 or 4 years. I doubt it. He was acquitted in the court case against him. So let's keep this on the book mainly, not about other matters. Okay, Mallika?
Is that for me?
No, not only for you.
Thank you. Good evening. I have to say that I'm not going to go on to the court case, but I have to say that I had a lot of people totally horrified that I was sharing a stage with you. I also have to say that Tehelka was a game changer, and I was a very, very strong advocate of it. Ever since the Me Too movement has started, many of us have had to look at the work of artists and ask ourselves whether the artists and the work can be separated. I love Woody Allen films. From everything that I hear, he's been a shit with a whole posse of women. Similarly with so many other artists. So I have decided to take the work and not the person. This book came to me, it's 740 pages, and it arrived at my doorstep on Monday. And I set myself the task of, besides my normal work routine of trying to read 100 pages a day. And I have to admit that I've come up to page 580, and then this afternoon I quickly read the end. Because I thought that if I don't know what the end is, what am I going to ask? And I'm going to start with something that you quote, which for me is, you say, the written word is the sturdiest loader in the world. It can carry any weight you put on it. The weight of regret and sorrow, the weight of desire and longing, the weight of profound loneliness. Did this book come out of jail sentences, loneliness, being isolated, being pushed alone?
Well, all writing of any meaning emerges from lived experiences. What you do with that is, of course, complex. I mean, every writer in the world treats his material differently. But nobody writes something that is not in some sense experienced, even if it's only inside their own head. I mean, there has to be some kind of lived experience on which you build. In my case, I have to say that when this accusation was made against me, and I realized immediately that I didn't have the accusation of a woman against me, I was now about to get the entire might of all the vested interests that Tehelka had ever exposed in its 10-year career, ganging up to go for me, which is exactly what happened. I actually entered, and I'll say this, I mean, I've never spoken about any of this in public. I've not said a word, by the way, about any of this. The only thing I ever told people off the record when they came to me was, there's CCTV footage of this incident. Please go and see the CCTV footage. And it's an incredible tribute to the masterly journalism that we have in India, that nobody actually asked for the CCTV, which was with the police. The police did not give us the CCTV. It took me 3 years to go to the Supreme Court and bring out the CCTV. And the CCTV footage is what exonerated me completely. It was an entire variance. And actually, on the morning of the 22nd of November 2013, when it was announced by Parikar himself, so the Chief Minister of Goa was holding press conferences about this ostensible incident that happened in a 7-star hotel among some rich, privileged people, where the charge was also of harassment and nothing more. When they filed that charge sheet, and they filed an FIR for many, many heinous offenses, not harassment, within an hour, I was in fact sitting in Ram Jethmalani's house at that point, and I got a call from my office to say that the FIR has been filed. Sitting in Ram Jethmalani's house on my mobile phone, I wrote out a press release. It's still in the public domain. You Google it, it'll come up. I said, I have just heard that the Chief Minister of Goa has announced the lodging of the FIR and has also said that there may be CCTV footage of the incident. And obviously, Parikar has said it with great glee, imagining, oh, we got CCTV footage, which the hotel had informed him. And so now we fixed the guy. I issued the press release to say, I've just been informed that the CCTV footage exists. I implored the Goa police to obtain, examine, and release the CCTV footage in the public domain so that the truth may be out. It's there, Google it, it'll come up. 22nd of November 2013. Nothing was done. The CCTV footage was collected from the hotel. The CCTV footage was suppressed by the Goa police. It remained suppressed for 3 years. It took us 3 years to go to the Supreme Court. My great friend Kapil Sibal, I owe it to him. And finally, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice's bench, ordered the CCTV footage to be given to us. And the CCTV footage is there. It's still not been asked for by any journalist to be released. When it was shown, and everybody used to ask me, why are you always so confident about the case? I said, because I know the material in the case. And you have to understand that cases in this particular category are all in camera. There's you, your lawyer, the prosecution's lawyer, and the judge, and the judicial staff. There's nobody else there. All this evidence was being put in court. The court knew what the evidence in the piece was. But nobody was interested, like everything else. You take a position, you stick to your position, you're not interested in evidence. And it's come home to roost in this country today. Nothing matters. No amount of evidence matters for anything. Forget me, I'm a very small piece of this whole public kind of torque that has taken place. But to come back to what the question you asked me, and we're going to stick to that, because the only thing I really want to talk about is the book, because the book is the meaning of the session. So within 24 hours of this happening, I understood something very clearly. I entered a bubble inside myself, and I knew that I was about to gain access to the kind of material that artists dream of. I know that for privileged people like me, and when I say this, I mean in the first world and the third world, we have entered a zone of such utter sanitization in our lives that it's become almost impossible to firsthand acquire the material that truly constitutes literature and art. Within 24 hours, I knew I was about to get the privilege and access to material that is absolutely, inimitable, that is original, that's real. And I lived inside that cocoon for the 6 months it took me to get my bail, right? I didn't care at all of what was happening outside. Not one piece of noise infiltrated inside my head, inside my cocoon. I was filing away every experience that I was undergoing. All my antennae were up. I was recording everything. I don't take notes usually. I let the material mature inside myself where the books are concerned. And so I was in a very, very good place. I was actually in a very fine place, processing the material, understanding perfectly. But you're an artist yourself, Mallika. You know that there's a chasm between the idea and the execution. There's a chasm between material and its fruition. The material is all around us. In every day of our lived lives is material, A Virginia Woolf or a James Joyce will make a classic out of a day, Others will take a lifetime to create the work. The material is always there. The challenge always is, how do you make art out of lived life? How do you make art out of lived material? So I had the material. It was bubbling inside me. I came out, and I think a week later, my mother had died while I was incarcerated. And I came out, and a week later, I discovered my father had cancer now, and he was going to die. And I remember I sat by his bedside because I wanted to spend all the time with him. And I wrote. And for 2 years, I just wrote without taking pause. And I'm sorry for having inflicted that big book on you, but that's what emerged from it, yeah, you know.
No, it was not sorry. It was just that it came to me only 5 days ago.
You know, so, so I mean, the material was there. And I have to say that when I was done with it, I was extremely gratified. I thought I had done justice to my material. I thought the material was extraordinary. And it was exactly the kind of material that interests me. It's a material that all my books are, in some sense, deal with very similar material. But in this case, this was a zone that I could never have entered. Having been there and come out, I realized people who write about that from the outside know nothing. You know, you can imagine many things. You cannot imagine that.
Who has read the book from amongst the audience? Can you raise your hands? Okay. The book is savage. It is brutal. But all of us who keep our eyes and ears open at all know that so is our society. We know what goes on in the police. We know the brutalization of the police itself. You take savagery, and in the later chapters you go into the lives of the people that has led to this savage response. In a situation like that, one doesn't know whether to sympathize and empathize and hate the consequences. But if this is the conundrum, is there any way out for a society like India?
You know, it's always almost impossible to sum up literary works in, you know, a few sentences. I mean, if I could offer, first of all, you have to remember the novel is not there to offer solutions to anything. Sure. Yeah, all right. And if one could offer it in a page, one would not write 770 pages, you know. It's examination, and while you're right that the police scalpel is taken to the police, I don't think it's just the police. I'm also very empathetic to the police, let me tell you. I mean, there's a kind of crudity to constantly trying to find easy culprits for all our collective failings, you know. The police is very much part of who we are. I mean, it's exactly part of who we are.
No, that's why I'm saying that the police is also brutalized.
The police itself is brutalized, exactly. You know, I actually, and they are victim to the same pulls and pressures that we were hearing discussed by Rameshender Singh and Kamar right now. Who takes an order? Who gives an order? And what sort of society do you become? And all societies have, unfortunately, as a writer, the metabolism of power interests me hugely. And because I've been a very active journalist, that's my working trade, I have had close proximity to power. And the distortion, the fundamental distortion that power creates in all human affairs is extraordinary. It's been the same for 2,500 years across the world. Whether you see the Greek city-states, or you see the Roman Empire, or you see our own you know, sequence of kingdoms that have emerged here, all the way to now, you see the distortions that power creates. The malfunctions of the police are just a distortion of what power brings. And power, again, has endless layers. There's power play between a child and the parent. There's power play between the spouse and the spouse, between the employee and the employer. And somewhere, I think, what literature tries to do, in my opinion, is to provide some amount of brutal light into all these niches, you know. It somehow forces you, it ought to force you to re-examine the easy assumptions that you all live with, you know. I mean, my axiom for what literature ought to do is the famous Franz Kafka quote here, which is that great writing should finally, or great books should finally be the axe that breaks the frozen ice inside ourselves. So there is this frozenness that humans arrive at for various reasons. And a great piece of art, particularly among the articulate arts, you know, dance, music, the fine arts may be different, but at least in the articulate arts, it's very important that you create discontent. So I don't try to provide solace. I mean, I've had this question because my second novel, The Story of My Assassins, which became a very popular series called Patal Lok, when I wrote Story of My Assassin, I remember in France, somebody at Fnac once asked me, he said, Mr. Tejpal, I'm reading your book and I can't sleep at night. I said, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. I mean, I actually write to make sure you don't sleep at night. I want you to be disturbed. I mean, I don't try to provide solace. That's the job of other people. That's the job of entertainers, amusement. We are awash. We live in the age of amusements. We live in the age of entertainments, I mean, it's their job to provide you amusement, solace. It's not my job. My job is to make you very unhappy.
I must say, I take objection to your calling dance an unarticulate form.
I could see that coming, but take it for the spirit of it. It wasn't meant in the way you said, I mean, maybe
I
it may have
think
sounded.
my work is also meant to
No, I mean,
feed on disquiet.
No, but, yeah, it should. I agree with you. All art should.
We live in a society which lives by binaries. You are either with me or you go to Pakistan, or you are either a Hindu or you're a Deshdrohi, etc., etc., etc. And in these binaries, what I found very interesting is that your most brutal characters at the same time are also the most tender. Do you want to talk about that? The relationship between Bichu and the professor, for instance.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, Bichu, I mean, I knew somebody very similar to him, obviously not, I had to reimagine all the lives, but in core, I found the stories. So Bichu is a character in the book who actually ends up murdering 4 people. His lover, his lover's husband, and the 2 children, because they end up being witnesses. But he is infinitely tender towards this cretinous boy whom he takes on as a little ward of his and takes care of this cretinous boy. And in life, I find that we are all many things, I mean, we are at different times and we're different people. We are different things. I mean, no one person is one thing. We are all so many different things. Societally, we are so many different things, which is why, I mean, there's a line, I think somewhere in the book, which says, one of them asks, because both of them are illiterate boys, and one of them asks, what is Nehru? And the person who's replying says, Nehru is an idea that should never die.
Which was going to be my next question.
Okay. So I mean, the assumption there was, which is my deep core belief civilizationally, that what distinguishes our civilization, I mean, screw the country and all that, we are a civilization, we are truly a great civilization. What distinguishes the civilization is its genius for pluralism. And if we have any genius, the genius is the pluralistic genius. To accost that is to actually accost the very fundamentals of who we are, the genius of who we are. We are different. Every other great civilization that dates back to antiquity, the Greek, the Roman, the Egyptian, they've all been truncated. I mean, even the Persian, they've all been truncated, they've all been broken. This is the only unbroken civilization that the planet has seen. At least I mean, I'm sure if you speak to Pranay Lal, who was here earlier, he'll say, yeah, geologically, there's probably others. There's a whole hypothesis about it. But really, this is the great unbroken civilization. And the civilization is unbroken because it has a capacity for absorption. We absorb. We contend, but we absorb. We don't push back. So there is a kind of ability to absorb that keeps us going. So we expand, we absorb, we expand, we absorb, we expand in all kinds of ways. We are seeing something different being attempted now. And it's a political project. I mean, it's interesting that it gets often couched as a cultural project. For 75 years, it was couched as a cultural project. Today, it's a political project. One would still like to believe that this too will at some point undergo a phase of absorption. There will be some kind of absorption, Something will morph, something will change, something correctional will remain, something ugly will vanish. You have to hope for that, I mean, that's what you got to hope for, that something that's a wellspring will somehow reassert itself. If it doesn't, then we will be damaged. We will be damaged in the way these other civilizations have been badly damaged over time.
I'm glad to hear you sounding so optimistic and saying we will be damaged. I find we are deeply damaged.
No, but I mean, there's another, but that too, it's like getting a wound or a sore. It heals, I mean, I know because I have suffered. I mean, there's a friend of mine who laughs about it and says, you must be the only guy in this country who's been cleaned out twice by these forces, yeah? And which is true. I've been shut down in 2001 for 4 years and I was cleaned out a second time. Even so, I say it's a minor thing. This is a country where there's so many contending problems. There are so many contending issues, you know. I mean, ours are the least. And I have to say, I mean, I'm a great admirer of Mallika's because I know the immense battle she's fought herself. Apart from the fact that the sheer illustriousness of her family, I mean, Vikram Sarabhai remains a personal hero for me. I actually sat down and watched that series because I just wanted to see, you know, your father's, you know, it was a tribute to your father. And they were remarkable men, so they were always remarkable. This is not a country to be wrestled down for a long time by one idea or one person or two people or four people. It's not. You know, it'll reassert itself. Because we live in the immediacy of the present, we don't understand that the sweep of the... I'll give you a great example. It's a lovely example for everybody, actually. Francois Bernier, the French physician, he wrote a classic on traveling through India. He came to India to be at the court of the Emir of Agra as his physician. He came just at the cusp of the eclipse of Shah Jahan and the advent of Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. And he actually records that whole transition period. Dara Shikoh was the appointed heir apparent by Shah Jahan, but Aurangzeb wanted the throne. And so he records that entire transition period, how Aurangzeb finally outwitted Dara Shikoh. He records the actual battle in which Aurangzeb defeats Dara Shikoh, decapitates him, and sends his head to Shah Jahan and seizes power. But in that particular, his journals, there's a beautiful passage somewhere in the middle when I was reading it, where he talks about traveling through the villages of India. And he makes this particular comment, Bernier makes this comment, he says that wherever I travel through these villages, I always see these idols of gods and goddesses with little lamps burning in front of them. They never seem to go off no matter where I go. The point he's making is that this is the absolute apex of the Mughal Empire. Not Akbar, but Aurangzeb was the ultimate apex. That was the time when the Mughal Empire was at its largest. Even at its very apex, under being ruled by someone who was a zealot, what they call Sanatan Dharma, whatever the eternal religion or the eternal faith, it chugged along on its own quietly. Nobody could shut it out. At the end of the day, I keep saying that there is so much noise made, 800 years of Mughal rule, 200 years of British rule. We are still 82% Hindus, yeah? You know? There is something that, the point I'm trying to make is, we can get extremely frenzied in the short term, in the immediate term, and that too is okay because we live in the immediate. But when you step back a little to get perspective, you begin to understand that a civilization does not last 50 years or 100 years. A civilization lasts thousands of years. Yeah. So I hope, Mallika, I'm not saying I'll be right or wrong, but I hope that there'll be reassertions and corrections. Yeah. And so the spirit, to come back to the book, we are going off into other things. To come back to the book, I was trying to find, in writing this book, I wanted to find a joyous spirit, that there is at the end of the day, a joyous human spirit, even in the darkest of times, and even among the most wretched of people, because people need it to keep going. And somewhere, it's the beauty of that human spirit that keeps things moving, that keeps things going. And we've seen that in the case of the Holocaust, but you can even see that with people who have actually very little reason to hope when you see it from the outside. But people cling to things, you know. For example, I didn't write about a particular thematic in the book, which animates the book otherwise. I didn't want to state it, like I never used the word jail or prison in the entire book. I also didn't use this particular word, but it animates the whole book. What keeps people going inside is actually the imagination. If you have a great imagination, you survive beautifully inside a jail or a prison. I mean, at the end of the day, it's true not just to people inside the prison, but also people outside. It's the imagination that actually keeps you going against all odds. And if you don't have the imagination inside the walls of the prison, then you look to purloin it, to steal it from somebody who has. So you cling to people who can tell you the good story, who can lend you their imagination to keep going. And you see that everywhere. And those who fail in both, they become actually wretched even inside of the jail. You know.
I wanted you to comment on two things. One is I found your women characters very interesting. They have a certain life force which is not recognized usually by men and society. And they are the ones who keep the house going. They are the ones who keep the home going, irrespective of everything else. And in an earlier session, we spoke about that, about the whole women's work that is not recognized. And in the Dr. Hag story, what Goody does and how she plans.
She's the strength.
But she, with meticulous
unsentimental strength.
Yeah, unsentimental strength that has nothing to do with the husband.
That's true.
That was one. The second thing that struck me, and I had not thought about it, is when you say that a good 75-80% of the people under trials are bachas.
It's true.
And I was thinking, what will it do when, like in Gujarat, so many people have just been let out after 16 years, a group of Muslims have been let out after 16 years saying there's no case against you. What happens and how does that work? How does a brutalized innocent come out and not brutalize society?
It's really rough. It's really rough to record. I mean, in the 12 or 13 years that I ran Tehelka, I mean, these were the stories we were doing all the time, you know. And in fact, when this happened to me, I used to tell some of my colleagues and close friends of mine, actually my colleagues, I used to tell them that, you know, this is exactly what we've been covering all our lives. You know, some act of injustice. It's what we fought for each time. Now it's happening to us, taken on the chin. I mean, there are people who want to fix us. There are people who have been exposed by us. There are people who want to fix us. So we are getting fixed, taken on the chin. It's okay. I mean, much worse has happened to people that we've written about, which is totally true. And yes, the jails are full of young under trials. It's as I write in the book, the kingdom of the young. It's where the young rule. A jail is a zone of violence. It's a zone of the young. What it does to them, it's a bit peculiar because, you know, the human race we know, now coming to what he was talking about earlier, paleontology and then onwards to evolution, the human race's true success in its evolution has been its adaptability. It's universally acknowledged by all those who study this, that the reason we have survived and are the great sort of, you know, master race is because there's an essential adaptability about us. And we see that again and again. There are people who go through trauma and you keep wondering, how do they ever square with their lives ever again? How do they keep going? I mean, how does somebody lose a child and a spouse and parents to something, a disease, injustice? We've read the Holocaust stories endlessly. And yet they came through, they survived, they remade their lives. People become refugees, travel out, remake their lives. There's an element of adaptability that's incredible. But of course you're scarred. But of course you're wounded. But that's the human condition, you know. I mean, that you will be scarred, you will be wounded in different ways. Coming back to women characters, yes, it's true that, and there are many of them in the book, and they're all strong. But that has to do with my own utter fatal fascination for strong women, you know. My mother was a very strong person all my life. She was a good Punjabi peasant woman who taught herself, did her graduation, did her B.Ed, did her M.Ed, taught in missionary schools, went on to own and run her own school. My sister is a very strong woman. My wife is very strong. My daughters are forces of nature. All 80% of the people, colleagues who work with me, are very, very strong women. I mean, Tehelka's managing editor was a woman. Tehelka's investigations editor was a woman. I mean, so at the end of the day, I mean, it's something. I mean, I understand that fundamentally men are weak and women are strong. And that's my experience of this world there, you know.
Has it been cathartic?
No?
Has the writing been cathartic? Do you feel a sense of...
No, you know, I'm not the kind of, you know, chronic habituated writer that other writers are who need to write every day. I actually resist writing till I cannot escape it. I mean, I let the work mature, I let the work ferment for a very long time, till it begins to beat inside me, and I know if I do not now sit down, I will not be able to go on. So this is only the fourth novel that I've written, but each of them, all of them are fat books, but I wait for them to mature in their entirety inside my head, to order themselves completely. But once I sit down to write, then I write with an iron discipline. Then I write without pause, without distraction, no matter what I'm doing, whatever else I'm doing, because I'm always doing many things. But the writing itself then is very, very monofocused. There's no distraction where the work is concerned. So, is it cathartic? it's the work, it's the centrality. For me, the writing is my only pure core. It's the only place in my life I do not compromise at all. And I'm very grateful that my day job has always been of a journalist. I live off my earnings as a journalist. I never need to compromise on the literary work ever. I have never, not once in my life, changed a single word or a line for any editor or publisher where the books are concerned. I write them exactly the way I want to write them, and they're published exactly the way they're published. So it frees me up. I mean, I'm not writing to any market demand. I'm not writing to anyone's approval. I'm not interested in anyone's approval. I'm utterly pleased that nobody in this audience has read the book. Not a problem for me, because I genuinely believe that the true measure of all art is time. There is only one measure. There is no second measure of art. It's only time. If the books are being read 50 years from now, that means I've done something worthwhile. If they're being read 100 years from now, and they're still speaking to readers, then maybe I got it right. In the short run, everything is a masterpiece. We are all products of ceaseless engines of publicity and marketing.
And branding.
Yeah, ceaseless, I mean, every year, the global marketing engines tell you about 50 new masterworks. By next year, 45 are dead. By the end of the second year, 49 are dead. By the end of the third year, all 50 are dead. And the next 50 have been announced here. So it doesn't matter anything. I'll tell you, there's a lovely exchange between Balzac and Stendhal. So in 1840, Balzac wrote a gorgeous review, unsolicited, on Stendhal's The Charterhouse of Parma, which is a true classic. So Stendhal wrote two great classics, The Red and the Black and The Charterhouse of Parma. And so when he wrote the review, there was obviously, there was massive attention on Stendhal. Stendhal wrote a letter back to Balzac, a long letter back, contesting some of the things Balzac had said to Stendhal. And in that he writes to Balzac, it's 1840, he writes to him saying, I think around 1880, they will begin to understand what I've written. So he's comfortable. He's saying, yeah, and as it turns out, truly, it's around 1880 that people start waking up to saying, oh, that's Stendhal. That book is a seriously good book. It's another 40 years before Red and the Black is recognized as arguably the greatest book of the entire era. So it takes 100 years. Moby Dick, same story. Moby Dick, Herman Melville writes it in 1851. He thinks now the whole world will start up. The writer, the artist, somewhere always knows what they have created. Even by they live in doubt, which is the place all artists should live, they always have some sense of the true worth of what they have created. In 1851, when Moby Dick is published, Melville is waiting for the whole world to now start declaring him as the great writer. Nothing happens. The book is published, a few reviews appear, a couple thousand copies are sold. Nothing happens. 10 years go by, nothing happens. 20 years go by, nothing happens. It's 35 years later that Mark Twain and several others suddenly start sitting up and saying, my God, the great American novel, that's Moby Dick. There is something that's understandable about this process. Because if you're too much part of the zeitgeist, if you're off the zeitgeist, then in some sense, you are not getting it. You're part of the status quo. And great artists should actually be in great conflict with the status quo, So I would be unhappy to be actually part of any status quo with any of the writing work I've done.
I just wanted to share that two things. One is that when I took a position against the Gujarat government in 2002, I was hounded. There were arrest warrants out. I was warned by a journalist that on the day before the Diwali break, I was going to be arrested, and the airports and the station had already been blocked off. And like in The Sound of Music, I had to hide under a rug in the car and drive across the border to get to Udaipur, and then for the next 20 days, try and skip. This was the beginning of cell phones. Try and skip so that the arrest warrant wouldn't catch up to me, and get to Ahmedabad the day the courts opened. And then for the next 3 years, I was made to go to the police station every morning and every night, and my passport was taken away. And I remember the conversations I had with the police people. And the powers that be would phone and say, I hope you are giving her what you're supposed to be giving her. And the policeman would signal to me, I have your phone. And then they would say, when we retire, we really want to come and learn at Darpana, because this job has made us such individuals that there's only bitterness and hatred and anger. And we used to have these long conversations. And again, it was Kapil Sibal who got me out of it
Good man.
3 years later. But I also went through the fear, the terror, threats of my children being abducted, threats of the children of my colleagues being abducted, constant phone calls at night saying, give evidence against her, otherwise we'll take your wife away, whatever. And so, in many senses, being on the other side is a very different experience from imagining what it is like on the other side. And the kind of brutalization that the less privileged in India are forced to face every single day, from a person who is shoved in a queue because she's a woman, it looks like a Dalit, he's dark, etc. And the levels of anger that build, that explode when somebody just touches another person's scooter. We live in this incredibly volatile, violent situation. And given the sort of many phases that feed into it, our education feeds into it, the sort of brand manager who says that unless you buy this car, you are nothing, the kind of humiliation that goes on a daily basis. What does one change to actually change something fundamental?
You know, honestly, Mallika, I don't think there are any easy answers to this kind of stuff. I think there are very, very sweeping historical processes always at play. And all of us are actually molecular in these historical processes. Our agency is fairly limited. So when you're on the right side of the historical process, then efflorescence becomes an easy game. When you're not on the right side of the historical process, then you end up in strife. And I'm going to say it because my class of people, and of course Mallika is infinitely more, we have also been on the right side of historical processes. For 50, 60 years, people of my class have had, and everybody sitting here, have had disproportionate agency in this country. There was no reason that we English-speaking, anglicized, upper-class people should have had the kind of leverage that we enjoyed in this country, all right? It was because we were on the right side of this historical process. Today, the pendulum has swung, and there's another kind of historical process that has kicked in. And our agency has been diminished dramatically, you know? No, it doesn't matter anymore in the same degree whether you go to St. Stephen's or you come back from Oxford. And that too is okay. We have to take it on the chin. There's a fundamental vanity in assuming that where you stand is the only locus of the universe, you know? There are multiple locuses in this universe, yeah? And very often we can stand, whoever we are, in a locus that's not in vogue, that's not the fashion, you know? There's a very famous German writer called Theodor Fontane. I mean, he's considered the most important German writer between Goethe and Thomas Mann. And so in about 1868 or something, he's got this gorgeous passage where he talks about exactly this. He talks about being a molecule in a storm. And it's talking about great changes taking place where he personally has very little agency. So yeah, the best you can do actually is to hang on to some degree of personal integrity and dignity, you know, when these storms take place. You cannot really change the direction of the storm. You get what?
Yes,
yeah.
And you talk about the collective will and the individual will, and we don't have time, but that's something that I just think that however small a molecule you are, you can and must try and influence is perhaps the wrong word. Open up.
Yes, I'm all for that. My own life has been, as you know, militantly proactive. But I've seen no paradox between your personal need for militant activism or pacifism, whatever you choose, and your inability to impact the historical process. Both things are perfectly legitimate. You know, what you do and where you stand is for yourself. You know, I mean, when I say to you, I don't care whether you read the books or not, I'm doing it primarily for myself. There is something I need to do. So I sit down for 2-3 years of my life and write what I have to write. Beyond a point, after that, I am not concerned. So I'm saying, there is a kind of historical process, and in this historical process today, since we let us be brutal about what we are talking about, today, this class of people, our agency has been diminished dramatically. And I say it's okay. That's all right. I mean, today, I have had disproportionate agency because I came from a certain class. An army officer's son, a missionary school person who could write and speak the dominant language. Language itself is a hierarchy. I mean, the fact that we came from English gave us an advantage that was disproportionate for the longest time. Now, it may become a disadvantage in the coming decades, possibly. And I'm saying that too is okay. You've got to take this from where you stand and say, yes, there's another way of looking at the world. That legitimacy has its own space, just as ours had a space in the world. Yeah, you know?
I'm going to throw it open to the audience. Are there any questions or comments? Or?
Hanji.
Are there no mics?
कितनी 3 किताबें मैं the day I came out of the jail, I'll tell you, after my college years, I had the greatest reading time of my life. I cannot name 3 because by my bedside, at least 30 lie every day, you know. So, I mean, but what I can tell you is that I had an incredible time reading while I was in prison. When I came out, there was a photograph in the local papers. I was carrying books over my head when I got my bail. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to know which 3 books influenced you the most.
I can't reduce it to 3 books, but I'll tell you a book I reread. And I'll tell you what was the beauty of the book that I reread. Among the 50-odd books that I read in the 6 months there, I reread A Discovery of India by Nehru. And let me tell you, and I came out and I actually bought many copies for all my friends. I had read it when I was in college. I reread it, and it's thicker than my book. And here's what's interesting about that book. It's become very fashionable to try and diminish the man and the kind of giant he was. He was a giant by all global standards of the last 100 years as a global statesman. He wrote this book in Naini jail in 1945. He wrote it in 6 months, this 700-800 page book. He wrote it without any recourse to forget Google, without a library, without anything. He wrote it out of his head. His only librarian, his library resource was Abul Kalam Azad, who was a great scholar. So when he had a doubt, he used to go to him. But I'll tell you what moved me the most about the book was not the sweep that he gives it to you in the book. What was most moving about the book, which is why he's my only true hero, is that when you read that book, you will discover that there is not one line of bitterness in the entire book. It's 800 pages. Here's a man, and it's my trick. It used to be my trick question when I was younger and I used to speak in colleges. I used to ask them, how many years do you think Jawaharlal Nehru spent in jail? You know something, he spent more years in jail than Gandhi did. Gandhi spent about 9.5 years in jail, Nehru spent 10.5 years of his life in jail. And despite that, so here's a man in 1945, in jail already for 3 years, because in Quit India in 1942 he'd been arrested. There is no way of knowing in 1945 when he's in prison whether freedom will come, whether it will come in 2 years, 20 years or 200 years. There's no way of knowing. The Second World War is going on, it's not over yet. It's not known whether the Allies will win or the Axis will win. But this guy sits down and writes, he's 56 years old, 57 years old, he sits down and writes this magisterial tome. And there's not a line of bitterness, despite having spent 10.5 years of his life in jail and not knowing what lies ahead. That is true greatness. You know, that's true greatness.
I think everybody's running late. I'm sure Tarun will be available for other questions once we are off the podium. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tarun, for that.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
And I will go back and finish the book.
Please do.
Thank you, Mallika and Tarun.